Hello, gorgeous people. It's been a minute. I have been away and working on another project that had gotten shifted to the back, but I just had to come back and talk to you about this story. It's out of Alabama, but I think we missed the point if we think that the story is about Alabama. It's not. It's about at least two things. One is about the spread or the reality of prison abuse in the United States. It also, I think, touches into the insufficiency of racism. Although racism is definitely important, I think it speaks to the sort of finality of racism as the ultimate talking point when it comes to police brutality. This is a story that happened in Walker County, Alabama, which is south of Huntsville and just north of Birmingham. It is a predominantly rural and middle class area of the country. It's predominantly white. And what happened was a man whose name was Tony Mitchell was showing signs of having a serious psychotic mental disturbance. He showed up at his cousin's house. I believe it was his cousin. I'll get my details straight as we go through. And his cousin said he at first did not recognize him. He had lost a good 100 pounds. He had a history of methamphetamine abuse, and he showed up just talking basically out of his head, talking about things that just weren't real. He recently had experienced the death of his father, but in his psychotic state, he was saying that telling his cousin he needed to get back into the family home because he also had experienced early on the death of an infant brother, and he believed that there were portals in his house, one that would take someone to heaven and one that would take someone to hell. And he wanted to make sure that the soul of his deceased baby brother was transported into the portal into heaven. So clearly he was not in good shape mentally. And so his cousin called 911 to ask for an ambulance to take him to the hospital. But somehow they also communicated with the sheriff's department, and before the ambulance got there, the sheriff's officers arrived on the scene. Tony fired a shot at them, according to them, but did not hit any of them, and then he ran off into the woods behind his house, where he spray painted his face black. The officers managed to arrest him and to take him into custody. At the scene, Tony's relatives told him about the psychotic state he was in, and the sheriff's deputies assured him that they would get him help for his psychosis, for his mental situation. At booking, they decided that they were concerned about him committing suicide. So they took his clothes from him and kept him in the booking room where people are not supposed to stay except for during the booking process. But rather than transferring him to a cell, they kept him in that holding cell for the entire 2 weeks that they had him in custody. So he was in a holding cell, he was naked, they had taken his clothes, he had no cot to sleep on, he had nothing to use for a pillow, he had no blanket, He was naked on a concrete floor for 2 weeks, despite the fact that he was restrained. For unknown reasons, he was tased. When he was tased, his false teeth popped out. As I said, he was a user of methamphetamines, and his teeth had rotted out, and so he only had dentures. Without his dentures, he could not chew food. His dentures popped out on that first day, where they were put into a plastic bag and were not returned to Tony. So for the 2 weeks he was there, he was naked. He had only a concrete floor to lie down on. He had no blanket. He had no pillow. He had no cot. He had no toilet other than the drain in the floor. And he did not have his false teeth. So for 2 weeks, he was he was under stress physically, not only mentally, but physically when he got there. As I said, he had lost something like 100 pounds over the course of a limited amount of time. And he was under stress mentally. And they did nothing to provide any mental health care for him. He periodically was taken to the showers to shower and then brought back. And then towards the end of his stay at the Walker County Sheriff's Department, he was dragged out of a shower, and while he was wet, if I understand it correctly, he was restrained in a chair and then put in a walk-in refrigerator for a period of some 5 hours. Now, the door was not necessarily shut while he was in there, and there are photographs and footage showing corrections officers while he's on the floor and dying. The officers are chatting among themselves and even laughing. There were 2 nurses there, one nurse practitioner and one RN. Neither of them did anything to intervene on Tony's behalf. When it seemed apparent to the officers, the corrections officers, that he was near death, he was taking the kind of breath that people take when they are dying, which means that he was breathing no more than 2 to 4 times per minute. They decided that he needed to go to a hospital, and he needed to die in the hospital, I'm speculating here, rather than in the sheriff's office. They dragged him out, and at that point put him into an orange jumpsuit. And that was the first time he had had clothes on in 2 weeks. They put him in an orange jumpsuit, and they transported him, taking their time, transported him into a van. They didn't call an ambulance. They took him themselves to Baptist Medical Center in Walker County. When he arrived, during their check on him, they took his temperature rectally, and his temperature at that point was 72 degrees, which is well below the 96.8 degrees that we think of as being a normal person's temperature. The physicians tried for about 3 hours to resuscitate him. Ultimately, he passed away. This is one of the most horrendous cases of treatment by a prisoner that I've come across outside of maybe Abu Ghraib or some of those types of situations. Again, This was torture. This has been condemned. The use of temperature, for example, was condemned in the Geneva Convention. It has been the practice of many of law enforcement agencies to control temperature. For example, I've heard many times about Border Patrol putting people in the winter into an air-conditioned van, and if the detainees complain, they are then the driver will make the temperature colder, and just the reverse if the weather is hot. If the weather is hot and they ask for air conditioning, the driver will turn on the heat or turn it up. This is, again, contrary to basic laws of human decency, but it is, in fact, contrary to the Geneva Accords and is characterized as torture. So this is not something I'm pulling out of the thin air to try to amp up what happened. I think I am describing what happened very accurately. This was torture. It was a gross abuse of power. And again, I want to emphasize that we've heard so much about racism involved in police abuse of people they have arrested and their deaths, George Floyd. We could go on and on and on. But with Tyre Nichols, for example, even though all the officers who assaulted him were African American, still people found some sort of tormented, some sort of way to twist the race narrative into, well, the officers had internalized racism. Those sorts of things may have their place in our discussions about racism, but I think I think it's way off base and doesn't help when clearly the situation is the militarization of the police and just the free hand that police officers have to abuse the patients in their the people in their custody. So what I want to do next, for those of you who appreciate deep dives into these things, I want to read you much of the lawyer's complaint. Of course, Tony Mitchell's family is suing the sheriff's office. It is suing the sheriff. It is suing the public relations officer. It is suing the nurses and 4 or 5 other corrections officers. So I want to basically go through that with you so you can really get a much clearer idea of what happened. And I think we need to ask this with the question of, is racism the only thing we can talk about in terms of prison abuse? Or is the fundamental problem the police departments themselves and their militarization? I think we can also ask ourselves, what is the media's role in this? Now, people have been telling me, yes, the media is covering it, but I disagree. I think there's a big difference between news outlets mentioning something that happened in an Alabama prison and actually covering up the screens and the airwaves with this story. And I think we will, if you look, if you listen to public radio, NPR say, or if you read mainstream media, I think you will find that you have not been hearing about this story nearly to the extent that you heard about Tyre Nichols, George Floyd, Mike Brown, all the others who have died at the hands of police. Okay, so as I mentioned before, at this point, for those of you who like a really deep dive into these matters and want to get a better idea of what it is the lawyers, what their argument is going to be, I am just going to go through their complaint with you and take it from there. I will stick as closely to the complaint as I can, although I will not repeat things over and over. Sometimes some of the language appears a number of times, and I don't know if that gives us anything, but assuming I remember to, I will put a link to the complaint itself in the place that you put these things. And you can take it from there. All right, so the one bringing the complaint is Margaret Mitchell, who is Tony Mitchell's mother, and she comes as the administratrix of the pending estate of her son, Anthony Don Mitchell. She is suing Sheriff Nick Smith in his individual and official capacity, corrections officers T.J. Armstrong, Denzel Mitchell, Braxton Key, Bailey Gainey, Catherine Clegan, Jacob Smith, Jeremy Farley, Richard Holzman, Benjamin Shoemaker, Dayton Wakefield, nurse practitioner Alicia Heron, nurse Brad Allred, and investigator Carl Carpenter. And as the complaint starts out, it says, this is one of the most appalling cases of jail abuse the country has seen. On the night of January 25 to January 26, 2023, Anthony Don Mitchell, aka Tony, froze to death while incarcerated at the Walker County, Alabama jail. This case raises an appalling question. How does a man literally freeze to death while incarcerated in a modern, climate-controlled jail in the custody and care of corrections officers? The case provides contrasting examples of both the worst of humanity and also its best, without the malice, deliberate indifference, and failure to intervene of nearly a dozen corrections officers at the jail, and the cooperation of these officers and their superiors in a scheme to deprive Tony of his civil rights and ultimately of his life. Tony could never have been killed, likely by being placed in a restraint chair in the jail kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment and left there for hours. Nor would he have been denied the prompt emergency medical treatment that would have saved him after his removal from that frigid place, but also without the heroism of a corrections officer who dared to preserve security camera footage on her phone and get the recordings to the estate, in other words, to Tony's family. It would have been impossible for the estate to dismantle the scheme of silence and lies within the sheriff's department and reconstruct what happened to Tony on the morning of January 26, 2023. Although the medical examiner has not yet released the autopsy report, it is clear that Tony's death was wrongful, the result of horrific, malicious abuse, and mountains of deliberate indifference. While Tony languished, naked and dying of hypothermia in the early morning hours of January 26, and his chances for survival trickled away, numerous corrections officers and medical staff wandered over to his open cell door to spectate and be entertained by his condition, as shown by the surveillance camera screenshots included in this complaint. Any of these individuals could have saved his life by calling 911 and summoning an ambulance. No one did. Instead, corrections officers and their commanding officers worked together in a scheme to conceal the horrific abuse, delaying medical treatment for 5 hours, long enough to ensure Tony did not survive to tell the story of what happened to him. The estate, pursuant to the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, brings this action for redress against the corrections officers who, through their abuse of Tony, caused his death. The estate brings suit against the corrections officers who failed to intervene to prevent and stop that abuse. The estate brings suit against the corrections officers and jail medical personnel who were deliberately indifferent to Tony's serious medical needs and who failed to summon an ambulance or otherwise obtain the urgent emergency medical treatment he so obviously needed. Finally, the estate brings suit against the officials, including the sheriff and his communications officer, who ratified these other defendants' violations of Tony's constitutional rights and who also themselves actively participated in the scheme to hide and perpetuate the horrific abuse Tony suffered. As alleged below, this scheme began hours before doctors declared Tony dead, at a time when it was still possible to save his life. The parties are Margaret Mitchell, the mother of decedent Tony Mitchell, and the proposed administratrix of the pending estate. Sheriff Nick Smith is sued in his individual and also in his official capacity as the sheriff of Walker County. At all times relevant at this action, Sheriff Nick Smith acted under color of law. I'm going to intersect a sidebar here. I'm guessing that many of y'all, like I, did not understand what the color of law meant, so I looked it up. And what it means is basically that these officers, we might say, well, they were acting within the law because they are law officers. But in fact, the fact that they were law officers became their ruse, their impersonation of officers, and that they were actually acting in ways that were contrary to actual law. Corrections officers T.J. Armstrong, Denzel Mitchell, Braxton Key, Bailey Gainey, Catherine Clegan, Jacob Smith, Jeremy Farley, Richard Holzman, Benjamin Shoemaker, and Dayton Wakefield are corrections officers or former corrections officers employed by the Walker County Sheriff's Department. Each is sued in his or her individual capacity. At all times relevant to this action, each individual acted under the color of law. Nurse practitioner Alicia Heron and nurse Brad Allred are medical care providers employed by the private medical contractor in the jail. Each is sued in his or her individual capacity. At all times relevant to this action, each acted under color of law in that each performed a traditional state function as a provider of medical care to individuals incarcerated at the Walker County Jail. Investigator Carl Carpenter is an investigator employed by the Walker County Sheriff's Department. At all times relevant to this action, he acted under color of law. These are the statements of fact. And I'm going to skip ahead to get to the point at which Tony was arrested, because the information given above is repeated in the complaint below. The last member of Tony's family to interact with him was Steve Mitchell, Tony's cousin. On January 12, 2023, Tony showed up at Steve's house. Steve had last seen his cousin 3 months before, at the time of Tony's father's burial. Steve didn't initially recognize the man who appeared at his house. Tony, who was 6'3" or 4", had previously weighed around 240 pounds. Now, Steve first took Tony for an old man. Tony was haggard and emaciated, weighing no more than 140 or 150 pounds. Wearing socks but no shoes, Tony informed Steve that he wanted to tell him a secret that no one else knew. Obviously delusional, Tony told Steve that he, Tony, had a brother who had been stillborn, which was true. Tony further told Steve that his parents had put the baby brother's body in a box that was hidden in the attic of his house, which was not true and was delusional. Tony believed that he needed to tear out a wall in the attic so he could find the box his baby brother's body was in. Tony further believed that there were 2 portals in his house, one to heaven and one to hell. Tony believed that he needed to put the box with his baby brother's body in the portal to heaven so his baby brother could go there. Steve realized immediately that his cousin, having lost around 100 pounds from his healthy weight, having lived evidently in complete isolation during recent months, and spouting delusions about portals to heaven and portals to hell, was in serious need of psychiatric help. This was not the Tony that Steve knew and loved. Not wanting to let Tony out of his sight, Steve agreed to go with Tony to Tony's house and help him look for the box. At the house, Tony continued to be delusional, even after Steve and Steve's adult son, Jacob, climbed up into the attic with him and showed Tony that the box wasn't there. Tony insisted that the box with his baby brother's remains was hidden behind an exterior wall that he needed to tear out. Steve and Jacob left Tony at the house, promising to return and help Tony find the portal. Steve, not knowing how else to get help for his cousin, attempted to contact the Walker County Sheriff's Department. When he couldn't reach anyone at the Sheriff's Department, Steve eventually decided he had no choice but to call 911. Steve asked the 911 dispatcher if they could send someone to go check on his cousin. He told the dispatcher that Tony was talking out of his head about portals to heaven and hell, and that he appeared to be having a mental breakdown and that he was in an extremely degraded condition. The dispatcher asked if an ambulance was needed, and Steve told her that would be a good idea. When sheriff's officers arrived at Tony's house on Lost Creek Road, they encountered Tony in the same obviously delusional and psychotic state that Steve had experienced earlier that afternoon. A written statement released from the sheriff's office on Facebook states, in part, quote, "When deputies arrived, They observed Mitchell in the front yard of the residence. Mitchell immediately brandished a handgun and fired at least one shot at deputies before retreating into a wooded area behind his home, end quote. More officers arrived, including the SWAT team, and Tony was eventually arrested in the woods behind his home. A picture posted by the sheriff's department, reportedly within minutes of Tony's arrest, shows Tony with his face apparently covered with black spray paint. The defendant, Walker County Sheriff Nick Smith, was personally at the scene, supervising Tony's detention and arrest. Likewise, the defendant T.J. Armstrong, the public information officer for the sheriff's office, was personally at the scene. In close proximity to Tony at the time of his arrest, Armstrong took the photo of Tony being apprehended and posted it from his phone at the scene to the sheriff department's Facebook page. Within hours, the picture of Tony with his face spray painted black spread across social media. Steve Mitchell, Tony's cousin, was also at the scene with Tony's mother, Margaret Mitchell, at the time of Tony's arrest. After Tony's arrest, Steve spoke with defendant Armstrong. Armstrong told him that Tony was alive, although a little roughed up, and that he had taken a shot at the officers and they were planning to charge him. At the time of his arrest, Tony suffered from serious medical and psychiatric needs, including, but not limited to, severe drug addiction, psychosis, and malnourishment. Armstrong and every other officer at the scene were consciously aware of Tony's serious medical needs. Showing this, Armstrong told Steve that they were going to set Tony's bond high enough that he would not be able to bond out, and assured Steve that Tony would receive medical evaluation and treatment in jail. Armstrong told him, quote, "We're going to detox him and then we'll see how much of his brain is left," end quote, or words to that effect. After observing Tony in a sheriff's department vehicle with what appeared to be black residue on his face, Steve asked defendant Armstrong why his face looked like that. Armstrong and every other officer at the scene were consciously aware of Tony's serious medical need for acute psychiatric treatment. Showing this, Armstrong told Steve that Tony had informed the deputies that he had spray painted his own face black because he was planning to enter a portal to hell located inside his house. Tony was housed as a pre-trial detainee at the Walker County Jail from January 12, 2023 until his death on January 26, 2023. For the duration of his stay at the jail, Tony was kept in an isolation cell in the booking area. These cells are not intended for housing of detainees, but rather are meant to hold detainees temporarily during the booking process. The cell lacked a bed or other furnishings. There was only a drain in the floor that could be used as a toilet. The cell was bare cement, the equivalent of a dog kennel, but unlike a dog, Tony was not even given a mat to sleep on. Tony had no cloth uniform, possibly as a result of the jail's suicide watch protocol. In every video clip on which he appears during his incarceration, until deputies at last dress him in a jail uniform just prior to transporting him to the hospital on January 26, Tony appears completely naked. As a result of years of methamphetamine use and personal neglect, Tony had lost his teeth, and he used a set of false teeth to eat. He was wearing the teeth at the time of his arrest. Without his teeth, he would have been unable to chew solid food effectively. One of the first video clips that the estate's lawyers have of Tony, thanks to the heroism of the corrections officer who wanted his family and the public to know what happened to him, shows Tony, naked, being dragged out of holding cell number 5, likely on or around January 15, 2023, and tased by Braxton Key. Key is still inside the cell and not yet visible in the screenshot below. The corrections officer in the black shirt supervising the tasing is Captain Alicia Jotty Tidwell. The tasing caused Tony's false teeth to pop out. Instead of being returned to Tony, the teeth were evidently recovered and placed by deputies in a property bag. After Tony's death, his mother received the teeth in a sealed property bag bearing a date of 1/15/2023, indicating that Tony's teeth were placed in the bag by jail personnel on that date. After January 15, 2023, to the extent he was provided solid food at the jail, Tony would not have been able to chew it effectively. Another clip shows Braxton Key and Morgan Madison dragging Tony from the shower located in a bathroom in the booking area. Tony continued to suffer from serious medical and psychiatric needs while incarcerated as a pretrial detainee at the jail. These needs were obvious to every corrections officer and all jail personnel who came into contact with him. Defendant Armstrong, the sheriff's communications officer and his authorized agent for making statements to the public, provided a statement to news media regarding Tony's death, quoting in part as follows. Quote, on Thursday, January 27th, an inmate, you notice the date is wrong. On Thursday, January 27th, an inmate at the Walker County Jail was provided a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff, and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away. This statement is false, as Tony was not, quote, alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Tony was declared dead on Thursday, January 26, 2023, at 1:15 p.m. at Walker Baptist Medical Center. At some point that day, Steve Mitchell, Tony's cousin who had called 911, received a call from defendant Armstrong, who was at the hospital with Tony. Armstrong told Steve that Tony had refused to eat, that he had refused to speak with jail personnel, and that he allegedly refused to consent to a psychiatric evaluation. Armstrong described an incident when Tony had allegedly thrown feces at jail personnel. Armstrong further told Steve that it was, quote, the worst case of addiction we've ever seen, end quote. Showing that Armstrong was aware that Tony had been hypothermic prior to his transportation to the jail, Armstrong told Steve that Tony's body temperature had started dropping that morning and that they had had to carry him to the hospital. Another sidebar from me, in the South, when we say somebody is carrying somebody, we don't necessarily mean they are physically picking him up and moving him. What it means is that they are taking him somewhere. The only way for Tony's body temperature to have started dropping to 72 degrees in such a short period of time was for him to have been placed in a restraint chair in the jail kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment and left there for hours. Armstrong asked Steve to carry Tony's mother to the hospital because, in Armstrong's words, quote, Tony's not going to live, end quote. Armstrong also falsely told Steve that when deputies got Tony to the hospital, the doctor had asked Tony to sit up, and Tony had sat up, and that at this point he had a massive heart attack, but that for now they were keeping him alive. Contrary to the statement Armstrong issued to the press, Tony was not, quote, alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital, end quote. A video clip from the jail security camera system shows jail transport officers Jeremy Farley and Richard Holzman carrying Tony's limp body into a garage area at the jail on the morning of January 26, 2023, while Benjamin Shoemaker and Dayton Wakefield assist them with opening and closing doors. No medical personnel appear in this portion of the security camera footage. Clearly in no hurry, Farley and Holzman move without urgency as they carry Tony through a doorway into the loading and unloading area. Tony is not handcuffed. Ahead of them, Benjamin Shoemaker opens the rear door of a sheriff's department prisoner transport SUV. The deputies carry Tony, with one on either side, each holding him by the jail uniform at the shoulder and hips. Tony's shackled legs remain bent in the air. As the deputies near the SUV, they lay Tony on the ground beside the SUV, letting the head fall back on the cement while they stand around, seeming to deliberate how best to place the body in the vehicle. Tony lies between them on the cement floor next to the SUV's open rear passenger door as the deputies confer. The deputies lift Tony's body and place it, still in the same bent, seated position, across the back seat of the sheriff's department SUV. The deputies appear to push the body into the SUV, adjusting its position before closing the door. Again, moving with no particular urgency, the deputies walk around to get into the SUV, and the clip ends. This video clip captured events that took place at around 8:55 a.m. on January 26, 2023, after Tony had languished for 5 hours or more on a bare cement floor as his life trickled away to the complete indifference of numerous corrections officers and medical staff as explained in greater detail below. Dr. Timothy Jordan, the ER provider, made the following note that is contained in Tony's medical records. I have limited information on this patient other than was provided by sheriff deputies that accompanied the patient to the hospital. I was told by one of the deputies that the patient has been incarcerated since January 12th. I was also told by the deputies that the patient has not been eating or drinking for several days. He was brought to the emergency room by sheriffs, moving the patient out of the vehicle and putting him in a wheelchair. And he went outside and offered to move him to a stretcher. At that point, he was noted to have agonal respirations, breathing 2 to 4 times a minute. He was rushed into the ER and moved to our stretcher. He was unresponsive, apneic, and pulseless and cold to the touch. CPR was started and handcuffs were removed. His mother arrived in the emergency room about 3.5 hours into resuscitation and gave additional history. She said her son had been drug addicted for years. He had developed multiple abscesses. Hold on, Riley. He has been suicidal. He has recently been confused. She has not heard from him in weeks. She requested that we not continue resuscitation. I'm going to take a break and feed my doggies. Okie dokie, I'm back. Another note in the file states that during the attempted resuscitation, quote, patient was unresponsive but occasionally made some agonal movements, including swallowing and minor movements of an arm or leg. This is while CPR with external compression devices in progress. Initial rectal temperature was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees centigrade. He appeared to have vomitus on his uniform, end quote. Contrary to Armstrong's false statement to Steve, at no point did the medical records indicate that Tony sat up or that he had a heart attack while at the jail. Rather, the notes state, quote, pupils were initially fixed and dilated, but became responsive after CPR was initiated, end quote, and, quote, the patient remained in astole PEA and occasionally VFib. No spontaneous pulse was ever palpated. The doctor's notes further state, quote, there was never any purposeful movement or response to pain, end quote. As quoted above, the doctor's notes state, I am not sure what circumstances the patient was held in incarceration, but it is difficult to understand a rectal temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees centigrade, while someone is incarcerated in jail. The cause of his hypothermia is not clear. It is possible he had an underlying medical condition resulting in hypothermia. I do not know if he could have been exposed to a cold environment. I do believe that hypothermia was the ultimate cause of his death, end quote. The heroic corrections officer who preserved the security camera footage after Tony's death last saw him alive at 6 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, January 25, 2022, when she went off her shift. At that time, Tony was awake and talkative in the isolation cell in the booking area and not in any evident distress. 72 degrees is approximately room temperature in the Walker County Jail. The only way for a living person's body temperature to fall to near room temperature and for the person to still be marginally alive, as indicated in the medical records, and not a corpse that has cooled to match the temperature of its surroundings, is for that person to have been exposed to frigid temperatures for an extended time. Based on these circumstances, it appears that Tony was strapped into a restraint chair during the night of January 25 to January 26 and placed in the jail kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment for an extended time, possibly as punishment for deputies who had, quote, had a time with Tony, end quote, or as punishment for allegedly shooting at deputies. Security footage from the kitchen area still exists, showing what happened to Tony there during the night of January 25 to January 26. However, the heroic corrections officer who viewed and captured the security footage on her phone did not review footage from before 4 a.m., at which point Tony had already been returned to his isolation cell in the booking area, nor did she know to check the footage from the jail kitchen overnight. Denzel Mitchell was the jail supervisor on duty overnight from January 25 to January 26, 2023. The other corrections officers on duty that night include Braxton Key, Bailey Gainey, Catherine Clegan, and Jacob Smith. Each of these corrections officers knows exactly what happened to Tony during that horrific night. Each of them was deliberately indifferent to his obvious serious medical needs. Each of them, at a minimum, failed to intervene in an act of horrific abuse committed by one or more of their fellow corrections officers. According to incident reports viewed by the correction officer who preserved the videos, Jacob Smith and Braxton Key claim to have found Tony unresponsive at feeding time, i.e. around 4 a.m. The jail kitchen typically is opened at 3 a.m. to provide food for the morning breakfast run. This means that after Tony was removed from the walk-in freezer or other frigid environment, at least 5 hours passed before he was transported to Walker County Medical Center, despite his obvious serious medical need for emergency medical treatment throughout that time. Hour by hour, Tony's chances of survival dwindled, as captured in a series of chilling surveillance videos preserved by a heroic corrections officer so that Tony's family would know what happened to him. The first video that the estate has from the morning of January 26, 2023 was captured at approximately 4 a.m. This is after Tony has been returned to the isolation cell in the booking area from the freezer or other frigid environment. The video shows Braxton Key leading Alicia Heron, the jail's nurse practitioner, to the holding cell in which Tony can be seen lying on the bare cement floor. Supervisor Denzel Mitchell is also present and supervising. At various points, Key and Mitchell can be seen clowning and laughing as Tony lies motionless and naked on the bare cement floor in the open cell behind them, obviously in severe medical distress and in need of immediate emergency medical treatment. Alicia Heron, the jail nurse practitioner, enters the cell and spends a minute or two inside with Tony, but appears to provide no medical treatment and does not summon an ambulance, even though Tony's severe medical distress is obvious. At the end of this first video, from around 4 a.m., Tony, lying naked among what appears to be piles of trash on the floor of the isolation cell, can be seen raising his head, peering out at deputies as if pleading for help. But Braxton Key closes the door of the cell and turns out the light, leaving Tony alone in the dark. The next video provided to the estate appears to have been taken around the time of the 6 a.m. shift change. It shows Deputy Shoemaker opening the door of the cell and peering inside. In a subsequent video from around the same time, Shoemaker and Morgan Madison can be seen entering the cell with a sleeping mat. The morning of January 26, as Tony lay dying of hypothermia, appears to be the first time he was provided any kind of padding to lay down on during his 2 weeks of incarceration at the Walker County Jail. Prior to this, he had had only the bare concrete floor of the isolation cell. In this video taken between 6 and 7 a.m., Nurse Brad Allred stands at the door of the cell looking in at Tony, but provides no medical treatment, though Tony's need for emergency medical intervention is obvious. Instead of calling an ambulance or providing Tony with medical attention, Benjamin Shoemaker and Morgan Madison focus their energies on sweeping trash out of the cell, in which the lights are now turned off, and cleaning it, evidently sweeping or mopping around Tony as he lies dying on the floor, removing signs of the squalor in which Tony was forced to spend his final days. In a subsequent video taken that morning, Shoemaker and Madison can be seen entering the cell where the lights have now been turned on. Josh Jones stands outside the cell looking in. Haley Tidwell, the daughter of Captain Alicia Jotty Tidwell, also stands looking in at Tony. Captain Tidwell, wearing a black shirt, is also present and spends several minutes inside the cell. A female nurse, as yet unidentified, stands at the door of the cell looking in, but does not enter. The video subsequently shows Morgan Madison entering the cell carrying an orange jail uniform. This likely occurs at approximately 7:45 a.m. Brad Allred, the nurse, can be seen passing with the pill call cart. None of these individuals calls an ambulance or otherwise takes steps to provide Tony with the immediate emergency medical treatment he so obviously needs. In the penultimate video, taken around 8:30 a.m., Shoemaker rolls a wheelchair into the cell. Shoemaker, with the help of either Forley or Holzman, then brings Tony out of the cell in the wheelchair. For the first time in any of these videos taken over 2 weeks of detention, Tony is now dressed. Deputies have placed an orange jail uniform on him. Tony's body falls out of the wheelchair outside the cell. The deputies lift him back into it. Deputies can be seen shackling Tony's feet as his body makes slow, seemingly spasmodic movements. Tony is still alive at this point. After initially placing him in the chair, deputies pick Tony up and drag him back inside the cell, evidently to conceal his presence, as a new female detainee is brought into the booking area and processed, further delaying Tony's access to the emergency medical treatment he obviously urgently requires. Again, none of the deputies, Shoemaker, Wakefield, Forley, or Holzman, calls for an ambulance. Even after the female detainee has been processed, Shoemaker, Wakefield, Forley, and Holzman show no urgency but stand around talking outside the closed cell door for a while. At long last, the 4 deputies finally bring Tony out again and carry him through the door to the Sally Port to place him in the Sheriff's Department SUV for transport to the hospital as described above. By the time deputies arrive with Tony at the hospital at 9:23 a.m., over 5 hours after deputies first were captured on video, laughing and joking while Tony lay naked on the cement floor of his cell in obvious need of emergency medical treatment, he had no pulse and only agonal respirations of 2 to 4 breaths per minute. Deputies did not inform hospital staff that Tony had been placed in a freezer or other frigid environment or that he was hypothermic. Doctors learned Tony was hypothermic only when they took his temperature after beginning emergency resuscitation efforts. Learning that Tony was hypothermic caused physicians to immediately change their course of treatment, as the measures they had initially employed were inappropriate to resuscitate a person who is severely hypothermic. Despite the heroic efforts of emergency medical personnel at Walker Baptist Hospital to warm Tony's body and over 3 hours of continual attempts to resuscitate him, Tony was pronounced dead at 1:15 p.m. that afternoon. And here are some other instances of sadistic treatment of inmates and their subsequent deaths. But I'm going to omit that. As I say, if you want to, you can find that language, and you can see the numbers here. But continuing just with the Tony Mitchell case, which was so prolonged, at any rate, Sheriff Nick Smith and his communications officer T.J. Armstrong participated in the scheme to deny Tony's constitutional rights and ratified the conduct of the deputies who violated Tony's constitutional rights by issuing a false statement to news media regarding Tony's death, quoting in part in news media as follows, quote, on Thursday, January 27th, and in, never mind, I think I'm going to skip that because I read it before. Armstrong also participated in the scheme to deny Tony's constitutional rights by giving false information to the family about his condition, including telling Tony's cousin Steve that when deputies got Tony to the hospital, the doctor had asked Tony to sit up, and Tony had sat up, and that at this point he had a massive heart attack, but that for now they were keeping him alive. Sheriff Nick Smith, Investigator Carl Carpenter, and T.J. Armstrong participated in the scheme to deny Tony's constitutional rights and ratified the conduct of the deputies who violated Tony's constitutional rights by investigating the corrections officer who preserved the video of Tony being carried into the Sally Port, along with the other videos referenced above, and retaliated against that person by interrogating her, confiscating her phone, and imaging its contents, suspending her, terminating her employment for allegedly leaking the video contradicting Armstrong's statement, and sending an officer to intimidate her. Sheriff Nick Smith ratified the conduct of Morgan Madison by selecting him as the Corrections Officer of the Month. immediately after these events. Each of these defendants acted with malice and or with deliberate indifference. Tony's death of hypothermia was the direct and proximate result of these defendants' deliberate indifference or malice and of their ongoing denial of Tony's constitutional rights under a scheme that continued to operate after his death through the issuance of false statements to family members and the media and the investigation of and retaliation against the person who preserved the videos to prevent the public from learning the truth and to thwart justice from being done. The plaintiff seeks the following relief: award judgment in her favor against defendants jointly and severally in an amount to be determined by the jury for compensatory damages. Award punitive damages against defendants sufficient to punish them and to deter further wrongdoing. Award plaintiff reasonable attorney's fees and costs pursuant to 42 U.S.C. Section 1988. Award plaintiff all litigation expenses, costs, and prejudgment and post-judgment interest at the maximum daily interest rate allowable by law, and such other relief as the court deems just and proper. The plaintiff demands a trial by struck jury on all issues so triable. Respectfully submitted. And these are the names of the counsel for the plaintiff and of the counsel in Birmingham. So that's the complaint. As I say, everyone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. But I'm trying to come up with any scenario by which the defendant's lawyers can overcome all of this. I think it is highly unlikely. And I think, once again, I hope this is not seen as a story about Alabama and Alabama rednecks and all of the tropes that are out there. Instead, I hope this will be looked at as an incredibly egregious instance of torture and abuse inside a United States jail. And for the record, the use of temperature to torment prisoners has been described as torture by the Geneva Convention. It is serious, and in this case led to Tony Smith's death, allegedly. I hope we can use this as an opportunity to have a more productive discussion about the United States carceral state, the people with whom it began, who continue it. I hope we can continue to embrace racism as a real problem, not to mention the problems that women face when they're in prison, but not let racism continue to be the only media-worthy story, which translates into basically the only discussion that we are having. Everything has to come back to racism in the media and, as a consequence, in public discussion in the public square. I hope we can do these things. I hope, there's Carly. I hope that we can begin to value knowledge not only about African Americans who are tortured and tormented by police officers and in custody, but by white people, by indigenous people who are also being overlooked in this discussion, by women per se, by undocumented people, that we can begin to talk about such things as for-profit private prison contracts and quotas and all the other things that we really are going to need to get our hands around if we are to do what's right, if we are to be at all prophetic, if we are to tell truth to power, and if we actually have any expectation that things will change. And I know for a fact certain that when people get a head of steam up, that we have tremendous power and that we can change things. It is not outside the realm of possibility by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, as I think I said before, if you have any comments you want to make or anything you want to discuss further, to the degree that I can discuss it, keeping in mind I'm not a lawyer. I am an historian and a theologian. I cannot answer legal questions. If you have comments, put them in the comments section. Please, please, please consider sharing this. It has to go, it would have to go viral, I think, for it to make a difference to Tony and his family and to get the conversation shifted in a better direction. And thank you again for being here, for listening all the way through if you did. And if you found this content of interest and important, would you please consider subscribing? And I guess that's it for now. Thank you. Take care of yourselves. And bye-bye.